August 15, 1945. Tokyo. The air is thick with the scent of ozone and charred cedar, a lingering perfume of the firestorms that had claimed the capital months prior. In the ruins of a neighborhood that once pulsed with the life of a million souls, there is now only a crushing, unnatural silence. The summer sun, a relentless white orb, beats down upon the gray skeletons of burnt-out streetcars and the twisted remains of corrugated steel roofing. Millions of Japanese citizens stand frozen, their heads bowed low toward the nearest radio speaker. From the crackle of the airwaves comes a voice never before heard by the public, the high-pitched, archaic tones of Emperor Hirohito. He speaks of enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable. With those words, the spiritual foundation of a nation, built upon the concept of Gyokusai, or the honorable shattering of the 100 million, begins to crack. This moment was the prologue to an unprecedented encounter. For nearly a decade, the Japanese people had lived under the shadow of a single, terrifying narrative, that the war was a holy struggle for survival against foreign devils, who sought only the complete annihilation of the Japanese race. The propaganda was absolute. Civilians were taught that American soldiers were monsters who would bayonet infants and humiliate women before executing every able-bodied man. This was not merely a government slogan. It was a deeply ingrained physiological fear. In the schools, children practiced with sharpened bamboo spears, told that when the invaders landed, their only duty was to kill one American before dying themselves. The expectation was not of a peace treaty or an occupation, but of a Götterdämmerung, a final bloody sacrifice on the shores of the homeland. As the first Allied planes began to circle the airfields at Atsugi, the atmosphere in the cities was one of a funeral wake. People retreated into the shadows of their makeshift shacks, hiding behind blankets and debris. The historical records of the time describe a population paralyzed by the Kaidatsu state, a condition of total exhaustion and despair. They were a people who had already lost everything: their homes, their sons, and now their pride. The silence of the streets was the silence of a nation holding its breath, waiting for the first blow of the executioner's axe. They expected the rumble of tanks to be followed by the screams of the hunted. They expected the end of their history. Yet, as the dust began to settle on the cracked runways and the heavy boots of the 11th Airborne Division hit the soil, a different reality began to emerge. The soldiers who stepped off those planes were not the snarling beasts of the posters. They were young men, many of them barely older than the schoolboys who had been trained to kill them, carrying with them a logistical tale of staggering proportions. While the Japanese had spent the last year surviving on a diet of sawdust, acorns, and the occasional sweet potato, the Americans arrived with a surplus of material that defied the Japanese imagination. This was the first glimpse of a power that was not just military, but industrial and humanitarian. The stage was set for a collision between a culture of scarcity and an empire of abundance, a collision that would begin not with a bullet, but with the clatter of a mess kit. The expected terror was a specter that had been meticulously crafted over a decade of total mobilization. Since the early 1930s, the Japanese educational system and state media had hammered a single, terrifying image into the minds of its citizens: the American Oni, or demon. This was not merely wartime rhetoric, it was a fundamental pillar of national defense. By painting the enemy as a subhuman force of pure cruelty, the High Command ensured that surrender would never be viewed as a viable option. Every child in the Japanese archipelago grew up hearing stories of American soldiers who collected the ears of their fallen foes as trophies and who utilized industrial machinery to grind the bones of the conquered into fertilizer. By late 1944, as the American island-hopping campaign drew closer to the home islands, this indoctrination reached a fever pitch. On Saipan and Okinawa, civilians had witnessed, and in many cases, participated in horrific mass suicides. They had been told that to fall into American hands was to invite a fate far worse than death. Women were instructed to carry concealed awls or kitchen knives, specifically to take their own lives or the lives of their children before the blue-eyed barbarians could reach them. The government-sponsored Manual of Personal Resistance taught that a true subject of the emperor should welcome death as a final act of loyalty. This psychological conditioning created a collective state of high-tension dread. In the minds of the elderly and the mothers left behind in Tokyo and Osaka, the arrival of the occupation forces was synonymous with the arrival of the apocalypse. The fear was compounded by a complete lack of information. With the Japanese merchant marine at the bottom of the Pacific and the internal rail lines shattered by B-29 raids, the average citizen lived in a vacuum of terror. They looked at the charred ruins of their cities and saw only the precursor to a final, ground-level slaughter. They expected a systematic cleansing. They believed that the Americans would arrive with empty trucks, only to fill them with Japanese men destined for slave labor camps in the frozen North, or worse. The concept of human rights, or Geneva Conventions, was a foreign abstraction that had no place in the grim reality of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere's collapse. Behind closed doors and in the damp shadows of air raid shelters, families made silent pacts. They prepared last meals of meager rice gruel and discussed how they would end their lineage if the Americans breached their neighborhoods. This was the profound tragedy of the Great Lie. A nation of millions was prepared to vanish into the earth to escape a monster that existed only in the pamphlets of their own government. They waited for the sound of the first American engine with their eyes closed, expecting the cold steel of a bayonet or the heat of a flamethrower. They were a people standing on the edge of a self-inflicted abyss, entirely unaware that the most dangerous thing the demons were bringing with them was not a weapon, but a gift of unprecedented mercy. August 28, 1945. The morning mist clings to the charred remains of Yokohama, a gray shroud over a landscape of jagged chimneys and skeletal industrial frames. From the horizon, the low, rhythmic throb of radial engines begins to vibrate through the earth, a sound that grows into a deafening roar as the first C-47 transport planes descend toward Atsugi Airfield. For the Japanese civilians watching from the periphery of the ruins, this was the arrival of the conquerors. They stood in the tall grass at the edge of the runways, skeletal figures in tattered kimonos and worn-out military tunics, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. They expected to see the monsters of their nightmares, but instead they saw the embodiment of a power they could not fathom. The first boots to hit the tarmac belonged to the 11th Airborne Division. These men were giants compared to the malnourished locals, their frames filled out by years of high-protein rations and rigorous training. They carried an air of nonchalance that was perhaps more terrifying to the Japanese than overt aggression would have been. As the soldiers fanned out to secure the perimeter, the civilians noted the staggering quality of their gear. Every strap was made of thick, supple leather, every uniform was stitched with heavy-duty thread, every weapon was oiled and gleaming. This was the first physical evidence of the American industrial machine, a force that had outproduced the entire Axis powers combined. The contrast was visceral. A people who had been reduced to wearing paper clothes and wooden clogs were now face to face with an army that seemed to have no limit to its resources. In the city of Yokohama, the arrival of the vanguard was met with a ghostly stillness. Shop shutters were slammed shut and bolted. The few remaining residents ducked into alleyways the moment a jeep appeared on the horizon. The barbarians were here, and the town was waiting for the inevitable pillaging. However, the American advance was marked by an eerie professional discipline. The GIs did not stop to burn houses or round up civilians for execution. Instead, they began the methodical work of establishing communication lines and supply depots. They moved with a purpose that was entirely alien to the local population, who had been told the Americans were a chaotic, undisciplined rabble. By the time General Douglas MacArthur's plane, the Bataan, touched down 2 days later, the dynamic of the occupation had already begun to shift from pure dread to a confused, wary observation. As the Americans set up their field headquarters in the new Grand Hotel, the surrounding streets remained empty of life, yet thousands of eyes watched from the darkness of broken windows. They saw the GIs tossing chocolate bars to stray dogs and sharing cigarettes with a few Japanese policemen who had remained at their posts. The expected wave of violence had not materialized. In its place was a clinical, overwhelming efficiency that suggested the Americans were not there to destroy what remained of Japan, but to manage it. This was the first crack in the wall of propaganda, the realization that the devils possessed a strange, quiet dignity that was nowhere to be found in the government's warnings. The hunger of the empire was not a sudden catastrophe of the surrender. It was a slow, agonizing erosion that had been hollowing out the Japanese soul for years. By late 1945, the average daily intake for a civilian in Tokyo had plummeted to less than 1,000 calories, a starvation level that rendered the simple act of standing an exercise in sheer will. The starvation policy, a byproduct of the Allied naval blockade known as Operation Starvation, had effectively severed the Japanese archipelago from its colonial breadbaskets in Taiwan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. The great Japanese Empire, which had once dreamed of a self-sufficient sphere of prosperity, was now a collection of skeletal islands where the most valuable currency was a handful of moldy rice. The physical toll was visible in the hollowed cheeks of children and the translucent skin of the elderly. Factual records from the Ministry of Health at the time noted a terrifying rise in famine edema, a condition where the body, starved of protein, begins to swell with fluid. To combat this, the imperial government had issued desperate proclamations, urging citizens to supplement their diets with emergency foods: ground silkworm cocoons, sawdust, and stalks of sweet potato vines. The once proud culinary traditions of a nation were reduced to a grim chemistry of survival. This was the new order at its final bitter end, a population so physically depleted that the will to resist the invaders had been replaced by a primal, rhythmic obsession with the next meal. In the bombed-out districts, the black market became the only true source of life, where a family heirloom, a silk kimono or a lacquered jewelry box, might be traded for a single tin of fish. The social fabric was fraying. The honorable citizens were forced into the bamboo shoot existence, peeling away layers of their belongings just to stay alive, much like peeling the skin of a bamboo shoot until nothing remains. There was a profound, unspoken irony in the propaganda that urged them to die for the emperor. For many, death was already a lingering guest at the dinner table. They were a people who had been told that spiritual strength could overcome physical lack, but by the autumn of 1945, the spirit was as exhausted as the soil. When the Americans arrived, they did not just find a defeated military, they found a humanitarian vacuum. The GIs, arriving with their pockets full of Hershey bars and their footlockers bursting with sea rations, stepped into a world where a single cracker was a miracle. The Japanese looked at the robust health of the American soldiers and saw the ultimate proof of their own leaders' failure. The starvation was not just a biological reality, it was a psychological weapon that had prepared the ground for a total ideological shift. As the first American transport ships began to unload massive crates of flour, powdered milk, and canned meat, the civilians realized that the demons possessed the one thing their divine emperor could no longer provide: the means to survive until tomorrow. The hunger that had once been a tool of imperial control was about to become the bridge to a new, democratic reality. The American abundance was not a secret, but its scale was a revelation that arrived in the form of a recurring, silver-gleaming object, the stainless steel ladle. In the weeks following the surrender, these ladles became the scepter of a new authority. At every impromptu feeding station and organized relief center, the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of metal against the sides of massive aluminum pots rang out like a new kind of church bell. For the Japanese, who had spent the war years cooking in chipped ceramic or rusted iron, the sight of industrial-grade, mirror-polished American cookware was mesmerizing. These ladles did not just dispense food, they dispensed the undeniable evidence of a civilization that had mastered the Earth's resources to a degree that made the imperial spirit seem like a hollow antique. As the U.S. Army set up its massive field kitchens in the plazas of Yokohama and Tokyo, The atmosphere changed from a military occupation to a logistical miracle. The air, which had for years been heavy with the acrid smoke of incendiaries, was suddenly filled with the rich, thick scent of beef stew, powdered eggs, and boiling coffee. To a population that had forgotten the smell of fat and sugar, these aromas were overwhelming, causing a physical reaction that many survivors later described as a dizzying, light-headed sensation. The GIs stood behind their long tables, their sleeves rolled up, wielding their ladles with an effortless, bored efficiency. They weren't rationing out half ounces of sawdust bread with the grim severity of the Japanese military police. They were scooping deep, dripping portions into whatever containers the civilians brought forward. The ladle represented a democracy of calories. In the imperial system, food had been a tool of social hierarchy and military priority, with the lion's share going to the front lines while the elderly and the weak were left to wither. Now, the American soldier stood as the arbiter of a different order. The ladle did not distinguish between a former bank manager and a homeless war orphan. It dipped into the same vat of life-sustaining nourishment for every person in the line. This was the first, most visceral lesson in American egalitarianism. The civilians watched, mesmerized, as the silver metal emerged from the steam, overfilled and spilling over the edges, a concept of leftovers or excess that had been purged from the Japanese vocabulary years ago. This abundance was backed by staggering data. By September 1945, the Supreme Command for the Allied powers had begun diverting thousands of tons of military rations to the civilian population to prevent a total societal collapse. The sheer volume of flour, corn, and tinned meats flowing through the ports was a logistical feat that the Japanese High Command had insisted was impossible. Every time a GI plunged a ladle into a pot, he was demonstrating the failure of the Japanese militarists' worldview. The demons had not come to take the little food that remained. They had brought a mountain of it with them. The gleaming steel of the ladle became a mirror in which the Japanese people began to see the reality of their defeat, not as a tragedy of honor, but as the inevitable result of a war against a nation that could afford to be merciful because its wealth was as vast as the ocean it had just crossed. The first organized feeding station in central Tokyo stood as a crucible of two worlds. Under the shadow of the partially collapsed Hibiya Hall, a line of thousands of Japanese civilians stretched for blocks, a silent procession of ghosts. Among them was a young woman, her back bent from carrying a toddler whose ribs were visible through a threadbare summer dress. She gripped a chipped ceramic bowl, her knuckles white with a tension that surpassed mere hunger. This was the moment she had been warned about for a lifetime. According to the rhetoric of the Imperial Army, this line was not for food, but for a final humiliation before the slaughter. Every step forward felt like a walk toward the gallows. She kept her eyes fixed on the dirt, flinching at the sound of heavy American laughter echoing from the trucks. As she reached the front of the line, the heat from the massive aluminum vats hit her like a physical blow. The scent was thick, fatty, and overwhelmingly rich, the aroma of American beef stew. She looked up and found herself face to face with a young sergeant from Iowa, a man whose shoulders seemed twice as broad as any she had ever seen. He held the recurring symbol of this new era, the large, polished stainless steel ladle. For a heartbeat, time suspended. She expected the man to bark a command, to spit on her, or to strike her with a heavy metal tool. Instead, the soldier looked at the child on her back, his expression softening into something unrecognizable to her, pity mixed with a quiet, casual friendliness. With a fluid, practiced motion, the sergeant plunged the ladle into the steaming vat. He didn't just provide a meager portion. He filled her bowl to the absolute brim, the thick gravy spilling over her fingers. Then, reaching into a crate behind him, he produced a thick slice of white bread, as soft and pale as a cloud, and placed it on top of the stew. The weight of the bowl was a shock to her hands, a physical manifestation of a caloric reality she had forgotten existed. The soldier nodded, a simple gesture of "move along," and turned to the next person with the same indifferent generosity. There was no demand for a bow of gratitude, no lecture on the greatness of the American state, and no violence. The woman stumbled away from the table, her legs trembling. She found a patch of shade near a scorched brick wall and collapsed. The child began to eat with a frantic, animal intensity, but the mother simply stared at the stew. The steam rose in her face, carrying with it the undeniable proof that the monsters who had supposedly come to destroy her were instead the only ones ensuring her survival. The dissonance was too great for her mind to bridge. This single act of feeding, performed thousands of times that afternoon across the city, was the tactical destruction of the imperial cult. In that bowl of stew lay the quiet, devastating realization that the enemy was more concerned with her life than her own government had been. The steel ladle had succeeded where the B-29s could not. It had finally broken her will to hate. The tears that began to fall into the steaming bowls across Tokyo were not the sharp, jagged tears of grief, but something far more complex, the weeping of a shattered worldview. As the steam from the American beef stew rose into the nostrils of the starving, it carried with it a truth that was physically impossible to ignore. For years, the Japanese people had been told that to be conquered was to be consumed. They had expected the Americans to arrive with the same predatory hunger that their own military had displayed in Nanking or Manila. Instead, they found themselves standing before men who seemed bothered by the heat of the vats but entirely comfortable with the concept of sharing. The crying was a biological release of a tension that had been wound tight since the first incendiary bombs fell. This emotional breakdown was a documented phenomenon of the early occupation. Civilians who had spent the war practicing with bamboo spears found themselves unable to maintain their fighting spirit when faced with a chocolate bar or a heavy ladle of thick gravy. The transformation was profound. It was the moment the great lie of the imperial government was exposed not by a counter-argument, but by a caloric surplus. When an American GI reached out to steady the hand of an elderly man whose bowl was shaking, or when a soldier laughed while letting a child try on his helmet, the psychological wall of the demon narrative crumbled. They were crying because they realized that their enemies were more human than the leaders who had demanded their mass suicide. The contrast between the shattering they were promised and the nourishing they received created a cognitive dissonance that could only be resolved through tears. Every sob was a rejection of the propaganda that had defined their lives. They had been prepared for a glorious, bloody end. They were entirely unprepared for a quiet, steaming beginning. The tears reflected a mix of relief, shame for their previous hatred, and a dawning, terrifying hope. They were no longer subjects of a divine emperor whose only gift was a mandate for death. They were becoming individuals in a world where the most powerful force was the ability to provide for one's neighbor. This transformation was the ultimate victory of the American occupation. It was a conquest of the heart achieved through the stomach. The symbolic ladle, rising and falling in its rhythmic, silver arc, was striking down the foundations of Japanese militarism with every serving. As the civilians sat among the ruins, weeping over their first real meal in years, the ideology of the past was being washed away. They were beginning to understand that the American demon was, in fact, an architect of a new kind of existence, one where abundance was a right rather than a privilege. The tears were the baptism of a new Japan, born from the steam of a kitchen and the unexpected kindness of a former foe. The logistics of mercy were underpinned by a scale of industrial might that redefined the very concept of an occupation. While the Japanese populace wept over individual bowls of stew, a massive, unseen machinery was working to stabilize the caloric intake of an entire nation. This was the era of the Garioa funds, government aid and relief in occupied areas. Through this initiative, the United States poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the shattered Japanese economy, not as a loan, but as a preventative measure against the chaos of famine. The goal was to provide a minimum of 1,550 calories per person per day, a target that required the importation of millions of tons of wheat, corn, and soy. At the height of the effort, the ports of Yokohama and Kobe were choked with Liberty ships, their hulls heavy with the bounty of the American Midwest, destined for the kitchens of their former enemies. This was a calculated, strategic benevolence. General Douglas MacArthur and his staff understood that a starving population is an unstable one, prone to the siren song of radicalism. To secure a democratic future for the Pacific, the Americans had to do more than just defeat the Imperial Army. They had to outfeed the lingering ghost of the imperial ideology. The recurring symbol of the stainless steel ladle was backed by the cold, hard data of the supply chain. In the first year of the occupation alone, over 800,000 tons of food were distributed. These were not the meager, rotting rations the Japanese military had provided to its own civilians during the war's final months. This was high-quality, fortified flour and vitamin-enriched milk, often packaged in bright, sturdy containers that later served as makeshift buckets or shingles for the ruined homes of the survivors. The American soldiers on the ground became the faces of this logistical miracle. GIs who had been trained for the violent invasion of Kyushu now found themselves transformed into distribution managers and amateur nutritionists. They worked alongside Japanese officials, often teaching them how to prepare the unfamiliar Western staples. There was a profound irony in the sight of a battle-hardened sergeant explaining the nuances of powdered eggs to a former schoolteacher who had once practiced killing Americans with a spear. The demons had brought with them a system of management that valued the biological survival of the conquered as much as the triumph of the conquerors. This was the logistical reality that made the tears in the steam possible, a deliberate choice to replace the sword with the grain silo. The factual records of the time show a dramatic plummet in the death rate from malnutrition and communicable diseases within mere months of the Americans' arrival. The occupation was proving to be a paradox, a military takeover that resulted in a higher standard of living for many civilians than they had experienced during the height of their own empire's expansion. The abundance was so visible, so tangible in the weight of the flour sacks and the depth of the soup vats, that it rendered any remaining pro-war sentiment obsolete. The Japanese people were witnessing the birth of a new logistical morality, where the measure of a nation's greatness was not the territory it could seize, but the number of lives it could sustain. The ladle remained the primary instrument of this new era, dipping into the inexhaustible well of American productivity to nourish the roots of a budding democracy. The transition from a landscape of starvation to a new foundation of civil cooperation was not built on high-minded treaties, but on the simple, repetitive motion of the ladle. By late 1945 and early 1946, the nature of the American presence had shifted from a military occupation into a massive civil engineering project of the human spirit. The school lunch program, introduced by the occupation authorities, became the cornerstone of this new social contract. Millions of Japanese children, who had spent their formative years bowing to portraits of a distant emperor while their stomachs withered, were now lining up for a daily meal provided by their former enemies. The sight of a tall American soldier handing a tin cup of reconstituted milk to a small Japanese child became the defining image of the era, a visual rejection of the Gyokusai suicide pact that had nearly extinguished the nation. This culinary diplomacy laid the groundwork for the rapid democratization of Japan. It is a historical reality that the implementation of a new constitution and the dismantling of the imperial cult were made possible by the stabilization of the Japanese diet. When the Americans introduced unfamiliar staples like wheat bread and powdered milk, they were not just providing calories. They were introducing a new sensory vocabulary. The bitter, gritty taste of wartime ersatz foods was replaced by the mild, consistent flavors of American industrial agriculture. This change in the physical environment fostered a change in the political one. A population that is fed is a population that can begin to think beyond the immediate horizon of survival. The hostility that had been nurtured for decades began to dissolve as the civilians realized that their new masters were more interested in their public health than their ideological purity. The symbolic ladle had effectively scooped out the rot of militarism and replaced it with a pragmatic, functional relationship. The Japanese people, famously observant of hierarchy and social debt, found themselves in a unique position. The or moral obligation they felt toward the Americans for saving them from the famine was a powerful catalyst for cultural change. It allowed for a smoother transition than any historian had predicted. The Americans were no longer the devils of the propaganda. They were the providers of the peace bread. This period of contact, characterized by the clatter of mess kits and the steam of communal kitchens, transformed the Japanese perception of power. They saw that true strength lay not in the ability to demand a glorious death, but in the capacity to ensure a dignified life. As the ruins of Tokyo and Osaka were cleared to make way for the first modern structures of the post-war era, the memory of the first American meals remained a foundational myth of the new Japan. The relationship was complex, born of blood and fire, yet it found its footing in the most basic of human interactions. The new order of the Pacific was being constructed on a foundation of shared vulnerability and unexpected compassion. The ladle had become a tool of architectural significance, used to stir the ingredients of a shattered culture into something entirely new. The era of the sword had ended, and the era of the breadline had begun, a transition that ensured that the next generation of Japanese would grow up with bodies strengthened by American wheat and minds opened by the sudden, shocking realization of their common humanity. The polished stainless steel ladle remains, in the quiet corners of historical memory, a more potent instrument of conquest than the bayonet or the incendiary bomb. It was the physical bridge between two civilizations that had spent a decade preparing to annihilate one another, only to find their commonality in the steam of a shared meal. The transition of Japan from a suicidal imperial cult to a global bastion of democracy was not a miracle of politics alone. It was a miracle of logistics and unexpected mercy. The Americans had arrived expecting a landscape of snipers and hidden traps, but they found instead a hollowed-out nation of starving mothers and children, and they made the world-altering choice to feed them. This was the true shattering, not of the Japanese people, but of the wall of hatred that had been built by years of absolute propaganda. The poetic truth of the occupation lies in the reversal of the Japanese expectation. A people who had been told to die for a divine emperor instead found life at the hands of a secular foe. The peace bread and the Garryoa stews were the first tastes of a new kind of freedom, one that was not defined by the absence of war, but by the presence of security and abundance. The sight of a GI pouring a generous portion of meat and vegetables into a cracked ceramic bowl was the ultimate refutation of the ideology that had led Japan into the abyss. It proved that the American democratic experiment was not just a collection of abstract rights, but a tangible, edible reality that could be shared with those who had once been sworn enemies. The power of the United States was revealed to be not in its ability to destroy, which was vast, but in its ability to sustain, which was infinite. As the decades passed and the ruins of Tokyo were replaced by the neon heights of a modern metropolis, the memory of those first communal kitchens began to fade into the realm of myth. Yet, the foundation remains. The modern relationship between the United States and Japan, characterized by a deep and enduring partnership, was forged in the heat of those early field kitchens. It is a legacy that speaks to a larger truth about the human condition. That ideology, no matter how deeply ingrained, cannot survive the simple, overwhelming evidence of a hand extended in kindness. The ladle was the scepter of a new era, stirring the ingredients of a broken society into a recipe for a lasting peace. It remains a reminder that in the aftermath of the world's most horrific conflicts, the most enduring victories are those won through the quiet, steady application of compassion and the undeniable power of a full bowl.